Hollywood thrives on illusion red carpets, bright lights, and the promise that every film is given a fair chance to shine. But beneath that polished surface lies a far darker reality. Some movies aren't simply ignored, they're intentionally erased. Imagine a completed horror film, edited, scored, polished, ready to meet its audience. And then, without warning, the studio pulls the plug. Marketing disappears overnight, release dates quietly shift, posters never arrive at theaters, publicity teams fall silent. No scandal, no announcement, just a slow, calculated suffocation carried out behind closed doors. Directors speak of sudden budget cuts that made no sense. Producers remember executives whispering that certain films were too risky, too strange, or simply inconvenient for the studio's plans. Some even believe their films stepped on the wrong toes politically, financially, or personally, and that the only solution was to bury them. Tonight, we exhume 15 horror films that were never meant to succeed, titles completed with full creative effort, only to be quietly pushed into the dark by the very companies that produced them. Let's begin with the first three that were quietly smothered. Fact 1. The Ninth Configuration, 1980. William Peter Blatty delivered The Ninth Configuration as a bold, deeply philosophical horror drama, a film that fused military psychology, religious inquiry, and surreal humor into something impossible to categorize. And that was exactly the problem. Executives were alarmed by its complexity. They didn't know how to sell it, and worse, some believed it would embarrass the studio if it failed. Their response was to shrink it into silence. Advertising budgets were slashed, press screenings were minimal, distribution was fragmented, with major cities receiving no showings at all. Even trade ads, typically a bare minimum, were canceled. Blatty later suggested the studio wanted the film to vanish quietly, fearful that its unconventional narrative would attract criticism they weren't prepared to handle. What could have been a defining entry in psychological horror was instead treated like a risk to be neutralized. It wasn't released into the world, it was released to disappear. Fact 2. Session 92001. When Session 9 was completed, it was unlike anything the studio expected. Slow, psychological, claustrophobic shot inside the decaying halls of Danvers State Hospital, it defied every commercial template of early 2000s horror. Executives didn't know how to market it, and worse, they didn't want to try. Rather than craft a campaign acknowledging its eerie, cerebral nature, they minimized the film's presence entirely. Posters were scarce, trailers nearly non-existent, and screenings were limited to a handful of art house venues. Even film critics reported they received almost no information or invitations, leaving the movie to debut in a vacuum. The timing was disastrous. Placed against major summer releases, it was drowned out instantly. Insiders suggested the studio intentionally sidelined the film to avoid diluting the performance of more conventional titles they were promoting. Only after its video release did audiences discover its brilliance and question why it had been suppressed so thoroughly. The answer was simple: the studio never intended for it to stand out. Fact 3. The Keep, 1983. The Keep began as an ambitious vision, a dark fantasy infused with mysticism, war, and dreamlike terror. But when production ran long and budgets swelled, the studio's patience evaporated. Instead of supporting Michael Mann's sprawling, atmospheric story, executives saw an opportunity to seize control. What followed was a brutal dismantling of the film's original structure. Entire subplots were cut, character arcs were erased, Mann's elaborate mythology was reduced to fragments. The studio demanded a drastically shortened runtime, resulting in a version that felt more like scattered memories than a cohesive film. Worse still, they barely promoted the film. Advertising was thin, theater placement was weak, and many audiences didn't even realize it had been released. Critics, confronted with a film gutted beyond recognition, dismissed it, never knowing how much had been stripped away. To this day, rumors persist about the missing footage. Reels locked away, lost in storage, or deliberately withheld. The tragedy of The Keep isn't just that it failed. It's that the version audiences saw was never the film it was meant to be. Fact 4. Curtains, 1983. Production turmoil plagued Curtains from the beginning. Director changes, reshoots, tonal clashes. But while the behind-the-scenes chaos was messy, it wasn't fatal. What truly buried the film was the studio's response. Once the final cut arrived, executives saw the fractured narrative as justification to wash their hands of the project. Promotion was minimal, Release dates shifted erratically, sometimes with mere days' notice. In some cities, the film appeared without posters, without ads, without any indication it even existed. Cast members later recalled not being invited to a premiere or being told when the movie was actually coming out. And yet, hidden inside this neglected release were some of the most haunting images in Canadian horror. The masked figure gliding across an ice rink, the unsettling doll imagery, the chilling set pieces. But the studio didn't care. They weren't invested in success, only in forgetting. It took decades for horror fans to piece curtains back together, giving it the appreciation that the studio denied it from the start. Fact 5. The Sentinel, 1977. Few films unnerved studio executives the way The Sentinel did. Its stark religious imagery, grotesque effects, and unflinching descent into supernatural dread made it a film that demanded to be marketed boldly. Instead, the studio panicked. Promotional commitments disappeared, one by one. Magazine spreads that had already been planned were abruptly canceled. International distributors complained that they were sent almost no marketing assets, leaving them to improvise with low-quality or unrelated artwork. The U.S. release strategy only worsened things. The film was scheduled to open against bigger, safer titles, ensuring it would be overshadowed before it even had a chance. Those involved later reflected that the film's dangerous tone made executives uncomfortable, too controversial, too intense, too unpredictable, rather than champion it. The studio allowed it to drift into obscurity, smothered not by critics or audiences, but by caution. What could have been a defining supernatural horror film was treated instead like a problem to minimize. Fact 6. Dead and Buried, 1981. Dead and Buried was crafted with the kind of unsettling atmosphere that should have made it a standout. A fog-drenched coastal town, eerie practical effects, and a mystery that blended small-town charm with rotting dread. But almost as soon as the studio previewed the final cut, concern rippled through the executive ranks. The film's grisly effects and bleak tone, they feared, might clash with the image the studio was trying to maintain at the time. Rather than take a risk, they quietly stepped away from it. Marketing funds were pared back until nothing meaningful remained. Posters arrived late, if they arrived at all. Distributors in several regions said they were advised not to prioritize the film, leaving it stranded in scattered, low-traffic theaters. Its release felt less like a rollout and more like a controlled containment. A film meant to disturb was instead placed in a corner where no one could see it. Years later, fans would wonder how such a memorably eerie horror film ever went unnoticed. The truth, it was never given the opportunity to be noticed at all. Fact 7. The Sender, 1982. At a time when horror leaned heavily towards slashers and spectacle, The Sender offered something different, a quiet, psychological descent into trauma, hallucinations, and psychic terror. Critics recognized its brilliance early, calling it one of the most atmospheric horror films of the decade. But the studio didn't want atmosphere. They wanted something loud, something easy to sell. Executives labeled the film commercially uncertain, a death sentence for any release. Marketing was slashed to the bare minimum. Plans for trailers and TV spots evaporated. Posters arrived late or not at all. Many theaters that did screen the film reported almost non-existent support from the studio. As a result, The Sender premiered in near total silence, drowned out by flashier releases with bigger campaigns. Even its strongest supporters admitted the film never stood a chance, not because of its content, but because the studio treated it like an inconvenience. It would take years, and the dedication of horror enthusiasts, for its quiet brilliance to rise above the silence imposed on it. Fact 8. The Boogeyman, 1980. Upon release, The Boogeyman stirred controversy for its unsettling atmosphere and its use of supernatural violence involving mirrors, a theme that provoked moral watchdog groups of the time. Instead of defending the film or leveraging the attention, the studio withdrew into a protective shell, terrified the backlash would taint their upcoming mainstream releases. Newspaper ads were quietly pulled, promotional budgets were frozen. Some theaters were told, unofficially, to keep the film low visibility. Posters that had been printed in anticipation of a full rollout were either discarded or left sitting in warehouses. In certain cities, the film opened without a single advertisement announcing it. What might have been a provocative, memorable entry in early 80 seconds, supernatural horror was instead treated like a liability. The studio didn't pull it from release, they simply refused to acknowledge it. And so, The Boogeyman drifted into obscurity, not because it wasn't seen, but because it was never meant to be. Fact 9. The Outing 1987. The Outing, later retitled The Lamp, was conceived as a supernatural creature film with an eerie museum setting and a mythology that set it apart from other horror releases of its time. But the moment internal studio priorities shifted, the film fell into a strange limbo. The title change alone fractured its early momentum, wiping out any buzz it had quietly generated. Even theater managers later admitted they received conflicting promotional materials, different titles, mismatched artwork, and in some cases, nothing at all. Marketing teams were instructed to reduce emphasis, a coded phrase that effectively killed visibility. Regional ads disappeared, TV spots never aired, and release dates drifted unpredictably. By the time the film reached theaters, its presence was a ghostly flicker, scattered screenings, empty lobbies, and audiences unaware the movie even existed. Only decades later did horror collectors realize that The Outing hadn't simply slipped through the cracks, it had been nudged there. Fact 10. Spookies 1986. Few films demonstrate internal sabotage as vividly as Spookies. After the original team completed their version of the film, the studio decided the project required a different creative direction, one they intended to control completely. In a stunning move, the directors were dismissed even after delivering a finished cut. A separate crew was brought in to shoot new footage, none of which aligned with the original story. The film was torn apart and reassembled into a bizarre, disjointed patchwork. Characters appeared and vanished, plotlines collided, and tone became impossible to interpret. Instead of acknowledging the chaos, the studio released the movie quietly. With a marketing push so thin, it was almost symbolic. Theatrical showings were minimal, reviews were confused, and audiences had no idea they were watching a film stitched together from two incompatible visions. Those familiar with the original material insist the sabotage was intentional, a power play that destroyed any hope the film had of standing on its own merits. The Spookies that audiences saw wasn't a creative misfire, it was the wreckage left behind after a takeover. Fact 11. The Being 1983. The Being embraced its identity as an eccentric creature, feature goo, chaos, and all. But while horror fans often celebrate that joyful weirdness, studio executives saw something else. A movie they feared critics would mock and audiences might not take seriously. Instead of supporting its quirky charm, they distanced themselves from it. Screenings were relegated to grimy midnight slots in fading theaters. Marketing was cut to the point where some regions never even knew the film existed. Newspaper listings were inconsistent. Advertisements that had been approved were canceled without explanation. Crew members later recalled how surreal it felt watching the film's release crumble around them. Every decision, from the venues chosen to the timing of screenings, seemed designed to minimize visibility. And yet, in spite of all efforts to suppress it, The Being found its way into the hearts of monster movie enthusiasts, thriving where the studio expected it to disappear. What the studio considered an embarrassment became, ironically, a cult treasure. Fact 12. The Initiation 1984. At first glance, The Initiation seemed poised to ride the wave of campus-themed slashers, dominating the early 80 seconds. It had the setting, the suspense, and a rising star whose performance tested surprisingly well with preview audiences. But just as early reactions suggested it might carve out a place for itself, the studio abruptly shifted its priorities. Another horror title on their slate demanded more attention, and The Initiation became expendable. Marketing materials that had already been drafted were quietly shelved. Press outreach stalled. Regional promo partners reported receiving mixed signals, with some told the movie's release wasn't worth a full campaign. Even posters that were printed never reached many theaters. When the film finally premiered, it did so half-hidden, lost in a chaotic schedule of mismatched showtimes and underpublicized screenings. Whatever momentum it might have built was gone before the first ticket was sold. Its failure wasn't due to audience indifference, it was the product of a studio unwilling to stand behind it. Fact 13. The House Where Evil Dwells 1982. A chilling supernatural tale set against the backdrop of Japanese folklore, The House Where Evil Dwells should have stood out in a decade crowded with American-centric horror. But behind the scenes, Disputes over distribution and ownership soured its chances long before cameras stopped rolling. Once the film was completed, the studio designated it as a contractual obligation rather than a feature worth investing in. Marketing efforts stopped almost entirely. Promotional stills were withheld, ads were minimized, and the theatrical rollout was so sparse that large markets never saw the film at all. Some theaters screened it for a single week, others never received materials to promote it in the first place. When audiences finally discovered it on home video, they were perplexed at how a film with such atmosphere had slipped away unnoticed. The truth was simple: it was allowed to fade on purpose. Fact 14. The Nesting, 1981. The Nesting emerged from production with a moody atmosphere and an unsettling sense of dread qualities that could have earned it a cult following. But internal friction between the director and studio executives turned the film into collateral damage. By the time editing finished, the studio had lost all interest in supporting it. Promotional campaigns slated for genre magazines were abruptly canceled. Distributors were told the film wasn't a priority. Even the modest advertising budget originally planned was slashed to nearly nothing. When The Nesting did arrive in theaters, it did so without any fanfare, no press screenings, no interviews, and, in some cities, not a single poster to announce its presence. To many involved, it felt less like a business decision and more like retribution. The movie wasn't simply released quietly, it was released to be forgotten. Fact 15. The Kindred, 1987. When The Kindred was finally assembled, a strange, ambitious creature film pulsating with practical effects, the team behind it expected at least a modest push from the studio. Instead, they were met with a chilling silence. Weeks before its release, promotional plans were abruptly frozen. Television spots never aired. Advertisements vanished from publications, and many theaters reported they never received the posters they were promised. Insiders later whispered that the studio found the movie too strange to market, but another theory circulated: a competing project needed the spotlight and burying. The Kindred ensured that attention wouldn't be divided. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. It opened quietly in a handful of theaters, tucked into inconvenient time slots where almost no one would stumble upon it. A film built on grotesque imagination and bold effects work was left to die, not because audiences rejected it, but because the studio had already decided its fate. Bonus: Grizzly 2, The Concert, 1983, released 2020. Among all the films studios tried to bury, none vanished as dramatically as Grizzly 2. What began as a promising sequel with a massive concert setting, an animatronic bear, and a cast that included then-unknowns George Clooney, Laura Dern, and Charlie Sheen, collapsed into chaos almost overnight. Production was underway, cameras were rolling, and the elaborate outdoor festival set had already been built when financiers abruptly withdrew. Crew members arrived to find the set locked down, equipment seized, and studio representatives refusing to explain what was happening. In a single day, the film went from nearly complete to abandoned. What footage existed was boxed up and lost in a labyrinth of legal disputes, missing documents, and conflicting ownership claims. For decades, Grizzly 2 became an industry legend, a phantom film whispered about by collectors and horror historians. Its young cast went on to become stars, yet their early roles remained trapped in a vault no one could access. Nearly 40 years later, fragments of the film resurfaced. A patchwork reconstruction was assembled and released, not as the movie it was meant to be, but as the echo of a project the studio had sealed away. Missing scenes, incomplete effects, and stitched-together sequences created a final version that felt more like an archaeological artifact than a finished film. Grizzly 2 wasn't simply mishandled, it was buried alive and only partially unearthed decades later. If tonight's stories revealed anything, it's that some horror films never face their true enemies on screen. Their real battles were fought in meeting rooms, behind closed doors, and in the silent decisions that ensured they would never be seen. If you want to keep uncovering the films Hollywood tried to erase, the ones pushed into the dark before they ever had a chance, stay with us. Follow the Night Shriek and step deeper into the shadows, where forgotten movies still whisper for an audience. More buried secrets are waiting.